Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you're new here, this channel is about real stories. Men and women who came to Vietnam looking for something and what happened when they found it, or thought they did. Some of these stories end in total disaster. Some end in something harder to name. Today's story is one of the harder ones. His name is Cobus. He's 54 years old, South African, and he spent the better part of 3 decades as an electrician in Pretoria, running his own business, building something real. He came to Vietnam after his life fell apart in the way lives sometimes do. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, the kind that takes years to fully understand. He arrived with more money than most people who end up on this channel, and more damage than he was letting on. He met a woman. He thought it was different. He thought he'd finally found what the title of this episode says he found. This one's going to stick with you, not because it's the worst story we've told, but because it's one of the most honest. Here's Cobus in his own words. I want to start by telling you what I did for a living, because I think it matters for the rest of this. I was an electrician, self-employed, 22 years in Pretoria. Ran my own small contracting business, mostly residential subdivisions in Centurion, some government work when I could get the tenders. You wire something right, it works for 30 years, and nobody thinks about it. Nobody calls you to say thank you. Nobody knows your name. It just works. That's the job. I was good at it. I was married for 26 years, mariage. We had 2 daughters, Ane and Karian. We had a house in Centurion that I'd been renovating piece by piece for about a decade. New wiring throughout, obviously, but also the tiling, the kitchen, the bathroom, the fascia boards on the roof. I did most of it myself on weekends. I'm not saying this to make myself sound like a good husband. I'm saying it so you understand what it meant when the settlement gave her the house. She left me for a man from our church small group. Their Tuesday evening Bible study. I'll leave it at that because if I say more about it, I'll be here all day and it doesn't change anything. The settlement was what it was. I kept the tools, I kept the pension, or what was left of it. The business got carved in half because she was technically a co-director, which I'd set up years earlier for tax reasons, and which I regretted in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I got supervised access to my daughters on alternating weekends. Carrion, the older one, stopped coming after about 4 months. She had her reasons. I didn't chase it. I told myself I understood. I didn't understand. Ane still called. Not often, but she called. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. I rented a flat in Boksburg, which is a fine place if what you're looking for is somewhere to be miserable without any distractions. And I sat in it for about 6 weeks before I rang a contact in Qatar and asked if he had work. He did. I want to be clear about those 18 months in the Gulf because people assume things. I wasn't running away, I was working. There's a difference and it matters to me. I went to Qatar first, 9 months on a commercial construction project outside Doha. Then a site in Abu Dhabi. The money was good, the conditions were not interesting. You work, you sleep, you eat, and eventually you fly home. Except I didn't fly home. When the Abu Dhabi contract ended, I was sitting in the Dubai airport with a carry-on bag, about 102,000 US dollars in a savings account, and 2 possible doors in front of me. Door 1 was Johannesburg, a new rental somewhere that wasn't Boksburg, and a life that was essentially the same life I'd left minus the house and the wife. Door 2 was everywhere else. I sat in that transit lounge for 4 hours. I watched YouTube on my phone because there was nothing else to do. And the algorithm, which knows things about you that you don't know yourself, started feeding me Vietnam. I want to be honest about this part. The videos were, look, they were compelling. Men my age, similar backgrounds, sitting in cafes in Ho Chi Minh City, talking about how far a dollar goes, how the food is incredible, how the people work hard and respect you. A few of them mentioned women. Most of them said it carefully the way you mention something you know sounds bad. I noted that, and I told myself I wasn't interested in that part. One was interested in the cost of living. I was interested in somewhere warm. I was interested in somewhere a man could start fresh, without the whole thing feeling like a consolation prize. Thailand came up in the algorithm too. I'm not going to lie, I watched those videos as well, but there was something about Thailand, I don't know, maybe it was the images. Maybe it was the way those men talked, that felt seedy in a way I didn't want. Vietnam felt different. The cities looked older, more complicated. The food in the thumbnails looked like actual food, not tourist approximations of food. The people looked like they had places to be. I booked a one-way to Ho Chi Minh City on a Tuesday. I left on the Thursday. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except Anae, and even then I kept it vague. I said I needed a change of scenery. She said, "Okay, Dad." She's a practical girl. I've always appreciated that about her. I am 54 years old. I've been in Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Boxburg. I have a carry-on bag and $102,000 in a savings account, and no particular reason to go home. And I'm going to Vietnam because the YouTube algorithm told me to. Looking back, that's a man in more trouble than he knows. I know that now. At the time, I thought I was just a bloke making a sensible decision about the cost of living. I think about the house sometimes. The house in Centurion. I think about the wiring in particular. I'd put in a full rewire about 5 years before she left, ran all new cable, sorted the earthing properly, upgraded the DB board. That house would not have an electrical problem for another 25 years at minimum. Someone is living in it right now, in a house that works perfectly, and they have no idea who made it work. They never will, that's fine. That's the job. But I think about it. I think about it more than I should. I landed in Ho Chi Minh City on a Thursday morning in March, and the first thing I noticed was the wiring. I know how that sounds. But when you've been an electrician for 22 years, you look at power infrastructure the way a dentist looks at teeth. You can't help it. It's just there. And the wiring on the street poles in Binh Thanh district was just like it was something. Bundles of cable 3 times thicker than anything you'd pass in South Africa, just draped between poles like wet washing, junction boxes hanging open, conduit runs that made no sense at all. I stood on the pavement outside the airport taxi drop-off and stared up at an intersection for probably 2 full minutes. It all worked somehow. That's Vietnam in a lot of ways, I'd come to understand. Chaotic on the surface, functional underneath. Or at least appearing functional, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. The heat hit me properly once I stopped staring at the wiring. March is not the worst month, I know that now. But coming from Abu Dhabi construction sites doesn't prepare you for this particular kind of wet, living heat. Abu Dhabi is dry and brutal. Ho Chi Minh City is warm and close, like the whole city is breathing on you. I was sweating through my shirt before I reached the guest house I'd booked in Binh Thanh. I'd chosen Binh Thanh deliberately, which is to say I'd watched enough YouTube videos to know I didn't want to stay in District 1 near Bui Vien where the backpackers and the bar girls were. I wasn't there for that. I was there to, well, I wasn't entirely sure what I was there for. To see if the cost of living was really what they said. To eat the food. To be somewhere that wasn't Boxburg or Doha. The first week I did what any sensible person does in a new city. I walked. I got lost on purpose. I took grab bikes when my feet gave out. I ate com tam from a plastic stool on a narrow hem off Jin Tien Huang. Broken rice with a grilled pork chop, an egg, some shredded stuff I couldn't identify, the whole thing costing maybe 45,000 Vietnamese dong. Call it $1.80 USD, and I thought, all right. The YouTube men were not lying about this part. One went back to the same stall 3 days in a row. I'd read the warnings before I came. There are forums, Facebook groups, YouTube comments. You can find an enormous amount of advice about Vietnam if you look for it. And a significant portion of that advice is essentially, don't be an idiot around women. I'd read it all, I'd absorbed it. I was 54 years old with a failed marriage and 18 months in the Gulf behind me. I was not, I told myself firmly, going to be that man. So I wasn't bar hopping. I wasn't on Tinder. I was genuinely, honestly, a middle-aged South African man sitting in cafes reading, drinking too much café soja, the iced coffee with condensed milk, which is extraordinary, and which I'd have injected directly into my bloodstream if I could, and watching the city go by. I was fine. I was even, in a quiet way, enjoying myself for the first time in about 2 years. The cafe where I met Lily was on a side street near the Tai Ngay Canal. The kind of place with no English on the sign and plastic chairs and a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly on every third rotation. I went there because it was close to my guest house, and they didn't look at me strangely for sitting alone for 2 hours. I'd been going maybe 4 or 5 days when I noticed the woman 2 tables over. She was working. That's what I noticed first, not what she looked like. She had a stack of printed worksheets and a red pen, and she was marking them with the focused frown of someone who takes the task seriously. I looked at the worksheets. Occupational habit, noticing detail, and could see from 2 meters away that they were English exercises, intermediate level by the look of it. Present perfect tense, maybe. So, a teacher. That's what I thought. A teacher doing her marking before school. She was, yes, attractive. I'll mention it because not mentioning it would be its own kind of dishonesty. But that wasn't what made me notice her. What made me notice her was the frown. It was a real frown. She was actually concentrating. She wasn't performing anything for anyone. I ordered a second sa fei sua jia. So did she, almost simultaneously. The woman running the cafe, who was approximately 100 years old and found me hilarious for reasons I never determined, brought them both out at once and said something in Vietnamese that made the teacher laugh. I asked what she'd said. The teacher looked up for the first time, considered me for a moment, then told me the owner had said I must be copying her order because I didn't know what else to ask for. I said the owner wasn't wrong. She smiled. Not deployed, not practiced, just amused. There's a difference, and you know it when you see it. I offered to pay for the second coffee. She considered this too, the same brief pause, then said, yes. We didn't talk much more that day. She went back to her marking. I went back to my book. But before she left, she asked, out of nowhere, what kind of electrical work I did. She'd seen me reading something technical, a manual I'd brought, some habit from the Gulf. And she asked specifically, not just, oh, you're an electrician, but was it residential or commercial, and was the work in South Africa different from other countries? And she listened to the answer. She asked a follow-up question. I cannot tell you how long it had been since anyone asked me a follow-up question about my work. I genuinely cannot calculate it. We exchanged numbers on Zalo before she left. Her name was Nguyen Thi Lynn. She said foreigners called her Lily. I said I'd call her Lynn if that was all right. She seemed surprised by that and then pleased. I walked back to the guest house thinking I'd probably not hear from her. She seemed like a woman with a life, with places to be, with no particular need for a large, sun-damaged South African at her table. That was fine. It had been a good conversation. I'd take it. She texted that evening, a short message, practical, asking if I'd found a better coffee place or if I was going back to the same one. I read it 3 times before I replied. I told myself it was nothing. Just a friendly local being welcoming to a foreigner. That's a thing that happens. I told myself that for about 2 more weeks. She texted most evenings, not long messages. A question about what I'd eaten, a comment about something she'd read, once a photo of a student's worksheet with an answer so wrong it was almost creative. They weren't romantic texts. They were just conversation. I hadn't had much of that in a while. We met for coffee again that Saturday. Then the following Wednesday. Then she suggested a place in District 3 near her language center, a narrow shop house with good bun bo hue, spicy beef noodle soup, which she ordered without asking if I could handle it, and watched my face carefully when it arrived. I could handle it. She seemed pleased by this too. There was no moment where it became a relationship. That's the thing I keep coming back to. No declaration, no formal agreement. We just started spending more time together, and at some point the time apart felt like the exception. About 5 or 6 weeks in, I moved out of the guest house into a proper apartment. My first place had been short-term, the kind of furnished room with institutional curtains that you tolerate when you're not planning to stay. I was planning to stay, or at least I'd stopped planning to leave, which amounts to the same thing in practice. Lynn helped me find the new place. She knew Binh Thanh the way you know a neighborhood where you've lived your whole adult life, which streets flooded in the wet season, which landlords were reasonable, which was too noisy on weekends because of the karaoke bar at the end. The apartment was 18 million Vietnamese dong a month, roughly $720. 2 rooms, tiled floors, a small balcony that looked out over a tangle of power cables and a noodle stall. I liked it immediately. She started coming over most evenings to cook. Not every evening, she had her own flat, her own flatmate, her own life, but enough that her shelf in the bathroom appeared without either of us discussing it. I noticed the shelf. I didn't say anything. I was glad it was there. This is the part where one need to be honest about what I was checking for, because I was checking. I'd been on enough forums, read enough cautionary stories to have a list in my head of warning signs. Declarations of love too fast. Requests for money in the first few weeks. A story that shifted depending on what you asked. Lynn had none of these. She had her own income. She was earning maybe 12 to 15 million Vietnamese dong a month at the language center, roughly 500 US dollars, which is a reasonable wage for that work in Ho Chi Minh City. She wasn't wealthy, but she wasn't performing poverty either. She paid for things. Not often because I was the one with more money and we both knew it, but she'd occasionally pick up a round of 333s at the Quan Now near my apartment or pay for a banh mi breakfast without making a production of it. I noticed, I approved. The phone upgrade, that was around month 2. Her phone had cracked when she dropped it outside the language center, screen completely gone. I offered to replace it. She said no, she'd manage. She'd been saving for a new one anyway. I said, don't be ridiculous. I have money and I'm not using it for anything else. She thought about it for 2 days, then said, okay, I'm telling you this because at the time I took her initial refusal as evidence of her character. She wasn't grabbing, she wasn't angling. She accepted eventually, yes, but she didn't ask. I think about that now. The way she played it. Whether that was calculation or just how she was. I genuinely don't know. Both things might be true. That the motorbike came at month 3. Her Honda Wave was stolen from outside her school, taken from a locked lot, which she said happened more often than you'd think. She reported it to the police, who were not, based on her telling, enormously optimistic about recovery. She started taking grab bikes to work, which cost her 100,000 Vietnamese dong a day, maybe 4 US dollars, but that adds up. I said I'd get her a replacement. She didn't say no this time. A used Wave in decent condition was about 18 million Vietnamese dong, roughly 720 US dollars. But I bought her a newer one, the entry-level model, 28 million Vietnamese dong, about 1,100 US dollars. What was I going to do, let her walk? I want to be clear, I don't regret the motorbike. I don't even regret it now. A woman needs transport in that city. It was a sensible, practical thing to do. What I didn't do was notice that it was the first time I'd spent money without it occurring to me to think about it. A man who spent 22 years quoting jobs and watching margins just handed over $1,100 without so much as checking the resale value. That's not generosity. That's a man who has stopped paying attention to money, and stopped paying attention because he's paying attention to something else instead. If I'd been honest with myself, I was happy. Not performing happiness, not talking myself into it. Actually content in a way I hadn't been since before the marriage ended. The apartment, the noodle stall below, the coffee in the morning, the sound of the city starting up around 6, the particular quality of light on the balcony before the heat came on properly. Lynn's markings spread out on my table some evenings, her red pen moving, that concentrated frown. It was a Sunday evening in late month 3 when she first mentioned her father. We were on the balcony after dinner. She'd made bo-ko beef stew, which I'd learned to eat with a baguette the way Southerners do. And she mentioned, without particular weight, that her father hadn't been able to work for nearly 2 years. Bad back. He'd been a construction worker in Binh Duong, the kind of work that catches up with you. She was sending money home when she could. Her mother's food stall helped, but didn't cover everything. She said it the way you say the weather is going to change, just, this is the situation. She didn't ask. That's what I kept thinking about afterwards. She didn't ask. I know what it is to carry a family. I know what it looks like when someone is just telling you the facts of their life without making it your problem. I respected that. I felt for her. And somewhere in the back of my head, in the part that was not yet alarmed by anything, a small door opened. She was asking for help, I decided. She was just doing it with dignity instead of with her hand out. And that was actually the more honorable way to do it, wasn't it? That's what I thought. That's exactly what I thought. She asked me the following weekend if I'd like to meet her family. She said it was fine if I wasn't ready, that it was just a thought that her mother had been curious about. And here she smiled slightly. The South African. I said yes immediately. And then I spent 3 days looking up on the internet what gift you bring to a Vietnamese family when you visit for the first time. I drove north on a Sunday morning with a bag of fruit and a bottle of rice wine I'd bought at the market on Hoang Deo 2. 45 minutes up to Binh Duong. The city thinned out into industrial sprawl and then into something older and quieter. I had somewhere to go on a Sunday. For the first time in I don't know how long. For the first time in a while, the house was on a narrow lane off the main road, The kind of lane where you have to pull the side mirrors in if a motorbike comes the other way. Concrete walls, a metal gate painted green, a small garden with a banana tree and some herb pots that had seen better days. The gate was open when I arrived. Someone had been watching for me. The mother came out first. Small woman, 60 or so, with the kind of energy that makes you tired just watching it. She was through the gate, both hands on my arm, talking in Vietnamese before I'd even properly parked. Lynn translated. She said I was too thin. She'd fix that at lunch. I am a very large man. I am not thin. I found this funny and I found it comfortable, which tells you something about the state I was in. Or the father was inside, sitting in a plastic chair near the doorway to the kitchen. He stood when I came in, which I could see cost him something. Older than I'd expected, mid-60s, lean, with the posture of a man whose back has been negotiating with him for years and winning. We shook hands. He said something to Lynn. She told me he said I had a strong handshake for someone who sat in cafes all day. She was smiling when she said it. I decided I liked him. There was a younger sister, Thao, 19, home from her polytechnic for the weekend. She was polite, pleasant, but there was something watchful about her, a quality of paying attention that was different from friendliness. I noted it and moved on. I was in a family home eating soup. I wasn't going to look for problems. Either brother Min was studying engineering in Jalat and hadn't been able to come. This was mentioned once briefly, then not again. I had no reason to question it. Students are busy. Jalat is 5 hours away. I stored the information and had another bowl of soup. One have to explain what that visit did to me because it's important. The mother had cooked for most of the morning. There was con chua, the tamarind soup with pineapple and tomato that I'd never had before, and asked about 3 times, and braised pork, and a whole fish, and rice and vegetables. The family altar in the corner had fresh flowers and incense. The walls had framed photos of the children growing up. Someone had swept the concrete floor before we arrived. I could see the broom marks still faintly in the dust. It was a family home, a real one, with parents who'd raised their children in it and were proud of them and sat at the table and passed food and talked too much and laughed at the foreigner who kept mispronouncing the name of the soup. I hadn't sat at a family table in 3 years. Not since before the divorce, before the flat in Boksburg, before Qatar, before all of it. I sat in that house in Bien Duong, and something in me that had been clenched for a very long time it loosened. That's not an excuse. I'm just telling you what happened. Month 5, the father's back reached the point where it needed proper investigation. An MRI, private hospital, the good one in District 1, which is what you use if you have the money and want reliable results because the public hospitals are managed and the queues are extraordinary. Lynn told me about it on a Tuesday evening while I was making coffee. She wasn't asking. She was telling me her week had been difficult and this was part of why. One asked, how much? She said 14 million Vietnamese dong, about 560 US dollars. I transferred it that night. It didn't occur to me not to. It occurred to me approximately as much as it would have occurred to me not to help a colleague whose car had broken down. This is a fact about me, not an excuse. The medication was ongoing after that. 3 million Vietnamese dong a month, roughly 120 US dollars for the pain management and the follow-up consults. And then the broader household situation? The mother's food stall covered some expenses, but the father's income had been 0 for 2 years. There were things that needed covering that Lynn had been covering alone, on a teacher's salary, and had been managing but only just. I looked at this the way I look at electrical work. Found the problem, assessed the load requirements, worked out a practical solution. I suggested a fixed monthly amount. 8 million Vietnamese dong a month, 320 US dollars, passing through Lynn to her mother. For the medication, the household bills, whatever gaps needed filling. I called it, privately to myself, the Family Maintenance Fund, because naming things makes them manageable. It wasn't charity, it was structure. I like structure. I was proud of having sorted it. I want to be honest about that. There was a genuine satisfaction in having seen a problem and fixed it, the same satisfaction I got from any well-diagnosed job. A family in difficulty was now less in difficulty, and I had the resources to make that happen, and so I had made it happen. Simple. And what I didn't do was track the cumulative total. Over the months that followed, months 6 through 9, the relationship settled into something that felt genuinely domestic. Genuinely good. Lynn was effectively living with me 4 nights a week. I was learning Vietnamese slowly and badly. She corrected my tones and laughed, and I asked her to correct me again so she'd laugh again. We went to Vung Tau for a long weekend, swam in the sea, ate steamed clams on the beachfront. I was, by any honest measure, content. But the maintenance fund had started acquiring additional items. A one-off payment here, a school fee for a younger sibling I hadn't heard mentioned before, a top-up there, something unexpected at the food stall, a repair. Always modest, always framed as temporary. 7 million this month, 9 million the next. I'm back to 8, then 10 for 2 months running because of something I didn't fully follow. I never tracked the total. That's the arrogance part. A man who spent 22 years watching margins on every job stopped watching margins the moment it was personal. I'd have laughed at a client who told me that. I'd have said, "Mate, that's how you end up in trouble." There's one other thing I need to mention from this period. Lynn's phone. She kept it face down on tables when we were together. Always. I noticed. I told myself it was a habit or consideration or just how she was. I wasn't going to be that bloke, the one who demands to see a woman's phone, who treats trust like a problem to be solved. I'd seen what suspicion does to a relationship. My marriage had ended partly because Marietje felt watched. I felt interrogated about her movements, and I'd told myself I would never be that man again. So I wasn't. And the phone stayed face down, and I never asked, and I told myself it was because I trusted her. Maybe that was even true. The brother in Ja Lat still hadn't visited. It had been 5 months of Sunday dinners in Bin Duong. His name came up perhaps 3 times, always briefly. Engineering was going well, Lynn said once. Then the subject changed, and I let it change. I think about that sometimes. Not obsessively, just I let it change. Month 9, Lynn mentioned the roof. She didn't frame it as a request. She was telling me about a phone call from her mother. The wet season had been bad that year, a lot of rain in Bin Duong, and water was getting into the kitchen ceiling. There was also a damp problem along the back wall. And the kitchen itself was old and cramped and had been a problem for years. She said her parents had been getting estimates from local contractors. She mentioned a figure, 180 million Vietnamese dong, about 7,200 US dollars. She was looking at her phone when she said it. Not at me. I want to be accurate here because I've thought about this moment many times. She did not ask me for the money. She said, "My parents have been getting estimates." That is all she said. What happened next was entirely me. I told her I'd drive up and have a look. This is what I do. You tell me a structure has a problem, my first instinct is to go and see the problem. I'm not sitting around discussing estimates I haven't verified. I drove to Bien Duong on a Wednesday morning and spent about 2 hours going over the house. And the roof was genuinely deteriorating. Older corrugated sheeting rusted at the fixings with 2 places where it had started to separate. In the wet season, water would be tracking under the overlap and down into the ceiling space. The kitchen was exactly as Lynn had described. Damp along the base of the back wall, a drainage issue, old tiling that had cracked and was letting moisture in. But the first thing I found, and before I even got to the roof, was the wiring in the kitchen. Old aluminum cable, the kind they used in the 70s, running to a power point behind where the refrigerator sat. Aluminium work hardens and becomes brittle over time. The connections were corroded, and the insulation had degraded in a way that made me put my hand up and tell the father to stop using that socket immediately. Not a request, a statement. He didn't understand my English, but he understood my face. He called Lynn. She translated. He nodded and unplugged the refrigerator himself without argument. I fixed the wiring that afternoon. Pulled the old cable, ran new twin and earth from the distribution board. They had a basic board, not great but functional. Properly earthed the point. Put a new faceplate on. Didn't charge anything. Didn't think about it. I couldn't just leave it. That's not in me. I approved the renovation estimate that weekend. The 180 million Vietnamese dong, the 7,200 US dollars, went to the father to manage. He knew the local contractors, knew what was reasonable in Bin Duong, and I had no reason to manage it around him. It was his house. I watched the roof go up over 3 weekends. I visited each time. I could see where the contractor had cut a corner on the fascia board fixings. Not dangerous, just sloppy, the kind of thing that would cause a problem in 5 years rather than 1. and I noted it without saying anything because it wasn't my house and it wasn't my job, and I had no standing to lecture anyone about how to build their own property. I said that to myself quite firmly. It wasn't my house. I said it more than once. The roof was real. I want to be clear about that. By the end of the third weekend, it was completely done. New sheeting properly fixed, the fascia board sealed, the kitchen drainage rerouted. I stood under it on a Saturday afternoon when a brief rain came through and listened to it hold. No drips, no tracking. It worked. I was proud. I genuinely was. I know how that sounds now. But in the moment, I was a man who had identified a problem, assessed it, approved the budget, and stood under the completed result in the rain. That felt like something. It felt like the kind of thing a man is supposed to feel. By month 11, the maintenance fund had crept up to about 10 million Vietnamese dong a month, 400 US dollars, through a series of top-ups I'd agreed to individually without ever sitting down and adding up what the total had become. I wasn't tracking it. I've said this already, but I want to say it again because I want you to understand that this was a choice, even if I didn't experience it as one. I was choosing not to look at the number. Then, month 12, something changed in Lynn. Not dramatically. She didn't suddenly become cold or strange. But there was a quality of preoccupation that appeared, a slight distance in the evenings that hadn't been there before. She said she was tired. The new semester at the language center was demanding. I accepted this. I didn't push it. I thought, she's tired. She's working hard. This is what a normal relationship looks like. Not everything has to be interrogated. I didn't push it. Month 13, over dinner at a place we liked on Huang Sa, a Quan Now with good grilled pork neck and cheap tiger beer, she mentioned that a colleague had offered to rent her his apartment cheaply. Her current lease was ending in 6 weeks. She'd need to decide soon whether to renew or move. She said it without pressure, just laying out the logistics. I heard the opening. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. And I offered the obvious solution. Why don't we find something together? The apartment came up at month 14. She had done her research thoroughly. A new development in Binh Thanh, a 10-minute walk from where we already lived, 2 bedrooms, the right neighborhood, close to her language center and close to everything we'd built our routine around. She'd spoken to the developer's agent. She knew the price, 38,000 US dollars for the unit. She mentioned carefully that foreigners could own apartments in Vietnam. She'd looked into it. There was a category of foreign ownership for residential apartments, maximum 50-year leasehold, some restrictions, but it was legal. The complication was that the developer's paperwork for foreign buyers had some administrative backlog, something to do with the project's land use certificate, the So-Jo, not being fully processed for mixed ownership. Registering in her name now would be faster by 3 or 4 months. We could formalize the arrangement afterwards with a loan agreement or a cohabitation declaration, she said. She'd asked around. I knew this was the risk. I want to be straight with you. I wasn't naive about Vietnamese property law. I'd read enough on the expat forums to know that putting money into property in someone else's name without documentation was the way most of the truly bad stories started. I knew this. I made a note to formalize things. Get a lawyer, get something in writing, do it properly. I put down 38,000 US dollars in cash. I did not formalize things. I knew her. That's what I kept telling myself. I had sat at her parents' table for 11 months. I had fixed her father's wiring. I had stood under the roof I'd helped build and felt the rain not come through. I knew her. We moved in on a Saturday in early December. Her flatmate helped carry boxes. The mother sent food from Binh Duong, a whole pot of con chua packed into a cooler bag, the tamarind soup I'd asked about 3 times at that first Sunday lunch. We put it on the stove and ate it for dinner in a half-unpacked apartment with cardboard boxes stacked against the walls and the city noise rising from Binh Thanh below. It was, for about 6 weeks, exactly what I thought it was. Home. The word I'd been reaching for since Centurion. Then it was Tet. Tet comes to Ho Chi Minh City like a slow detonation. For 2 weeks before the new year, the city fills with chrysanthemums and red banners and the smell of incense burning at every doorway. Firecrackers go off at odd hours. The traffic gets worse, then suddenly, on the day itself, stops entirely. The city empties as everyone returns to their home provinces, and for about 3 days, Ho Chi Minh City becomes the quietest place on earth. We drove up to Binj Duong on the first day of Tet. The road north was choked going out of the city. Motorbikes loaded with bags and children, and boxes of bon chung, the sticky rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves that Lynn's mother had been preparing for a week. I had a red envelope of leek money for the parents, which Lynn had told me was expected and appropriate. I had looked up the correct amount. I had, by this point, been attending these family gatherings for nearly a year. I knew how to bring the right things. I knew to use both hands when giving. I knew to wait until the eldest had eaten before I touched my bowl. The house was full. More people than I'd seen before. Relatives from further away, neighbors, an uncle from Bien Hoa who shook my hand for a long time and said something approving about my height. The family altar had been freshed with fruit and flowers and a photograph of a grandparent I'd never heard mentioned. The television was running a Tet variety show at a volume calibrated for the partially deaf. The rice wine was flowing from about 10 in the morning, and there was a young man I hadn't met before. He was introduced to me as a cousin. Lynn said it casually, gestured toward him as I came through the door. He was maybe 26, lean, with the look of someone who works outdoors. He nodded at me and moved away quickly. I shook his hand and thought nothing of it. There are always relatives at Tet I haven't met. The family is large. Vung Tau is a few hours south. People travel. I thought nothing of it. The afternoon wore on. I ate more than I should have. The rice wine tasted like nail polish remover, and I had several glasses anyway because refusing would have been rude, and also because I was having a good time. Or believed I was. The noise and the heat and the incense and the television, I had learned to exist in all of it without needing to understand it. I was the Thai at the table, the foreigner. They were used to me by now, and I was used to them. And for all its distance and untranslatability, it felt still like somewhere I belonged. Then from the kitchen came Lynn's voice, sharp and low, and Thau's voice answering, and it went back and forth twice before Lynn left the room without looking at me and went out to the garden. I sat where I was. The uncle from Bien Hoa was telling a story. Someone refilled my glass. Thao came and sat down near me, not across the table, beside me, which was unusual. She was holding her own glass of rice wine, and she had the look of someone who has been working up to something for a while, and has finally decided to do it. Her English was limited. She knew this and worked around it carefully. She said, "The man I had met as a cousin." She paused. "He is Min. He is her brother." I put my glass down. She said, "Jalat was not true. Min has been in Vung Tau for 3 years. He does not study. He has never studied." I didn't say anything. I was doing what an electrician does when he finds something unexpected behind a wall, going very still and looking at what's actually there rather than what he assumed would be there. Thao held up her fingers and made quotation marks in the air. "Stolen," she said. "The motorbike. It was sold." Then a family friend, a woman in her 40s who'd been at several of these Sunday dinners, sat down on my other side and said quietly that she could translate more fully if I wanted to hear it. I said yes. What followed was about 20 minutes, delivered in pieces, Thao speaking and the woman translating. Thao was not performing. She was factual in the way of someone clearing a debt. The maintenance fund, the parents had received some of it genuinely, yes. The medical costs had been real, yes. The MRI, the ongoing medication. But for at least 4 months, a portion of what I'd been sending had been redirected. Partly to Min and Vung Tao, the brother I had never met. Partly into Lynn's own savings account. Thao was also clear about what she was not saying. She wasn't saying her sister was a monster. She wasn't saying the parents were in on all of it. She was saying that the family had collectively decided that I was a solution to a set of problems, and Lynn had agreed to let them use me that way, and Thao had spent a year watching it and had finally tonight had enough of watching. I asked the translator, "Why tonight?" Thao answered before the translation was complete. She said one word I understood. Apartment. I found Lynn in the garden. The incense from the altar inside was drifting out through the doorway. She was standing near the banana tree looking at her phone. She put it face down when she heard me come out. I asked her about Min. She went still. I asked her about the motorbike. She looked at the ground. I didn't raise my voice. We were in her parents' house and there were 30 people inside, and I understood enough about this culture to know that what I was feeling, and I was feeling quite a lot, was not something to perform in someone else's garden at Tet. I said, "We'll talk in the car." The drive back to Ho Chi Minh City took 45 minutes. For the first 20, she said nothing. Then she began to cry, and I want to describe this accurately because it matters. She did not cry the way someone cries when they are performing remorse. She cried the way someone cries when they have been carrying something very heavy for a long time and have finally been allowed to put it down. She said the feelings were real. She said it once quietly, looking out the passenger window. She said her family's expectations were also real. She said she hadn't known how to explain the system to me and the obligation, who was owed what, how the money moved in a family like hers, and that by the time she might have found a way to explain it, too much had already happened, and there was no version of the explanation that didn't end with this conversation. She said she was sorry about Min. She did not say sorry about the apartment. I dropped her at the building in Binh Thon. Our building. I waited until she was through the lobby door. Then I drove to Pham Ngu Lao and checked into the first guest house with a vacancy sign and a room that didn't ask questions. There was a Tiger beer in the minibar. I put it on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed and didn't open it for a long time. She said the feelings were real. I don't know whether to believe that. I also don't know which answer is worse, that she meant it or that she didn't. I opened the Tiger beer eventually. It went warm while I sat there. I drank it anyway. When something breaks on a job, a circuit that's misbehaving, a fault you can't immediately locate, you go back to the source. You don't stand there staring at the symptom. You trace the cable from where it failed all the way back to where the power comes from, and somewhere along that path you find the problem. I've done this thousands of times. It's how you think when you're trained to think that way. So I did it. I sat on the edge of a bed in a guest house in Pham Ngu Lao with a warm Tiger beer, and I traced the circuit back. Phase 1. Ordinary relationship costs across the first 3 months. Meals, weekend trips, the Vung Tao long weekend, the phone, the motorbike. I added it up honestly. About $4,800. I don't regret any of it. That was just being a partner. Phase 2. The medical costs and the maintenance fund over 14 months. The MRI was $560. The medication running at $120 a month, call it $1,680 over 14 months. The maintenance fund starting at $320 a month and drifting upward. I calculated the honest average at around $380 across the full period, which came to roughly $5,300. The top-ups I'd agreed to individually without tracking them, which I now had to estimate from memory, came to maybe another $700 or so. Total for Phase 2, approximately $8,240. Call it $8,000 to keep the number round. Phase 3, the roof and kitchen renovation. $7,200. Real work, real result. I don't regret the roof. Phase 4, the apartment. $38,000. Registered in her name, no documentation, no contract. I knew the risk and I proceeded anyway. Miscellaneous, visa extensions, the trip to Da Nang we'd taken in month 10, various things I was rounding down, roughly $1,000. Total, approximately $58,000 across 16 months. I had started with $102,000. I had $44,000 left. I sat with that number for a while. $44,000. It's not nothing. A man can live on $44,000. I am not destitute. I want to be accurate about this because I've heard other men tell versions of this story where they arrive at the end with nothing, and that is not my story. My story is that I lost a significant amount of money to a situation I chose to walk into with my eyes partly open and partly closed, and I came out the other side diminished but functional. That's what it is. The apartment was the problem. That $38,000. I found a lawyer 2 days later. Another expat at the guest house mentioned him. A Vietnamese property lawyer who worked with foreigners in exactly these situations. The consultation took an hour. The advice was direct and not particularly surprising. Without formal documentation establishing that my payment was a loan, a joint purchase, or a contribution toward shared ownership, the apartment was legally hers. I had bank records showing the transfer. I did not have a contract specifying what the transfer was for. In Vietnamese courts, as a foreign national with no formal relationship to the registered owner, I was looking at a long, expensive, uncertain fight for an outcome that was far from guaranteed. The lawyer was honest. Possible in theory, impractical in reality. Legal fees alone would likely consume $10,000 to $15,000 before any resolution. And resolution was not assured. I did not pursue legal action. I made this decision over about 2 days and I stand by it. Some losses you absorb. That's also part of the calculation. On the third night, I called Anae. It was the first time in 4 months. She answered on the second ring. We talked for about 40 minutes. I didn't tell her what had happened. I'm not sure I had the words for it yet, or maybe I just wasn't ready to hear myself say it out loud to my daughter. We talked about ordinary things. Her job, she's a nurse, Anae, always has been more serious than her sister. A car she was considering buying. The weather in Pretoria, which she said had been cooler than usual. I asked if she'd heard from Carrion. She hadn't. I said I'd try again. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Some things take longer than you want them to. Lynn texted on the 5th day. A short message. She asked if I was okay. I read it several times. I still don't entirely know what she meant by it. Whether it was concern or guilt, or just the kind of message you send because not sending anything feels worse. I didn't respond. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not sorry about it either. I booked the flight home on the 14th day, via Dubai, Johannesburg, and then a taxi to a flat I'd rented in the east of Pretoria. Not Centurion. Somewhere without the weight of the old address. I had found it online the week before I left, a place that meant nothing to me, which was exactly what I needed. Now, from where I'm sitting now, what do I actually know? I know the family obligation was real. I saw the father stand up when it cost him something. I saw the mother cook for half a day to welcome a foreigner she had no reason to trust. I stood under a roof I helped build. None of that was false. The poverty was real. The need was real. The expectation that an eldest daughter carries her family, that is as old as this country, and it is not a scam. It is just a system I did not understand and walked into without asking anyone to explain it. I know the exploitation was also real. The brother in Vung Tau, the motorbike, the maintenance fund running into Lynn's savings account. These things happened. I know the feelings were probably real. She said so. I'm inclined, on balance, to believe her. Both things being true, genuine affection and calculated benefit, is not a contradiction in a person under financial pressure. It's just the complexity of people. I wanted a simple story. There isn't one. Here's what I've come to. I arrived in Vietnam carrying something I hadn't fully looked at. A man who builds things for families and then loses them. The house in Centurion. The wiring that works for 30 years and nobody remembers who did it. I came here and I found another family that needed things built, and I built them. And now those things belong to someone else too. That's not Vietnam's doing. Vietnam didn't create that pattern, it just gave it somewhere to run. A con man you can hate. This ag man, this I have to think about. That's where I'm leaving it, and that's where we'll leave it too. What Kobus described, and he was precise about it in the way that tradesmen are precise, is not a story about a predatory woman running a sophisticated scam on a naive foreigner. It is a story about a genuine cultural system meeting a man who was already primed to be absorbed by it. The obligation that Lynn carried toward her family is real, and it is ancient, and the eldest daughter who carries that obligation does not necessarily experience it as exploitation, even when, from the outside, that is exactly what it looks like. 3 things for anyone watching this who is thinking about Vietnam, or already in Vietnam, or in the middle of something that feels familiar. First, filial piety is not manipulation. It is an obligation that Vietnamese children, especially eldest daughters, carry with or without foreign partners. If you become her partner, you become part of that system whether you agree to it or not. Understanding the depth of that obligation before you're financially committed to it is not cynicism. It is basic preparation. Second, the apartment. Vietnamese property law is clear. Foreigners cannot own land. Foreigners can own apartments under specific conditions. Any arrangement that places your money in someone else's name without enforceable documentation is an irreversible decision the moment you make it. Get a lawyer before you hand over money. Get a separate lawyer from the one she recommends. This is not romantic advice. It is the difference between $44,000 and zero. Third, Kobus's vulnerability was not greed, and it was not loneliness, though both of those things were present. His vulnerability was a wound he carried from home, a house he built that was taken from him, a pattern of providing for families that didn't remain his. Vietnam didn't create that. Vietnam is not responsible for the contents of the bag you arrive with, but it will find them. Thank you for watching Inside Vietnam. If this story reached someone who needed to hear it, share it. If you've got a story of your own, you know where to find us. We'll see you next time.